Boa noite. Ele diz que a pessoa nunca tem uma doença, é a doença que tem a pessoa. No centro do Roda Viva esta noite está o Dr. Oliver Sacks, o neurologista que mudou o entendimento sobre o que é doença e o que é normalidade. Oliver Sacks é inglês, solteiro, tem 64 anos e vive em Nova York, onde é professor de neurologia clínica na Escola de Medicina Albert Einstein. Ele veio ao Brasil lançar seu 8º livro, A Ilha dos Daltônicos, onde ele analisa como médico e antropólogo uma comunidade doente, onde as pessoas são incapazes de ver as cores. Os outros 7 livros de Oliver Sacks já foram publicados no Brasil. O mais conhecido deles é Tempo de Despertar, que inclusive deu origem a um filme com o mesmo nome. A história é interpretada por Robert De Niro e Robin Williams, e é mais ou menos a própria história de Oliver Sacks, um estudioso do mal de Parkinson. Ele trabalhava em uma clínica em Nova York com um grupo de pacientes que sofriam da doença do sono e que estavam alienados do mundo real. Numa experiência polêmica, usando uma nova droga, o médico consegue tirar os pacientes do estado de letargia e trazê-los para mais perto da vida normal. Uma recuperação que ganhou mais força quando se percebeu que o envolvimento pessoal do médico com o doente era vital para o tratamento. Esse envolvimento, que leva à investigação biográfica da doença e à humanização da prática médica, está sempre presente nas ideias desse neurologista, que vem estudando com humor e compaixão o universo neurológico do ser humano. Para entrevistar o médico Oliver Sacks nessa noite, nós convidamos a Helena Katz, doutora em comunicação e semiótica pela PUC de São Paulo e crítica de dança do Caderno 2 do jornal O Estado de São Paulo e do programa Metrópolis, aqui da Rede Cultura. O Noval Baitello Júnior, doutor em Ciência da Comunicação pela Universidade Livre de Berlim e diretor da Faculdade de Comunicação da PUC, aqui de São Paulo. O repórter Ricardo Bonalume, da Folha de São Paulo. A Mônica Teixeira, que é diretora do programa SBT Repórter. O jornalista Leão Serva. O médico e escritor Moacir Scliar, especialista em saúde pública. E o professor e neurocirurgião Jorge Pagura, do Hospital Albert Einstein. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros. Como esse programa foi gravado, hoje, infelizmente, você não poderá fazer perguntas aqui para o nosso entrevistado, Dr. Oliver Sacks. Boa noite, Dr. Oliver Sacks. Muito obrigado pela sua presença aqui no nosso programa. Dr. Sacks, o senhor escreveu um livro sobre a doença do sono, um livro sobre enxaqueca, um livro sobre comunidades com problemas de visão. O que leva o senhor a escolher um objeto de estudo, a escolher um objeto para um livro?
I feel they choose me. I don't know that I choose them. A doctor's life is full of chances and unexpectednesses. I hear of things, but recently my interest has especially been not just in individuals, but in communities where an unusual disorder is rampant. But there have been really a series of accidents and nothing very systematic in my choice of themes.
O Moacir Scliar, por favor.
Dr. Sacks, o senhor é um representante dessa estirpe de médicos, escritores, e deu nomes como Chekhov, como William Carlos Williams, como Guimarães Rosa aqui no Brasil. Mas entre esses médicos e escritores era a rara figura do neurologista. A minha pergunta é se realmente existe uma associação entre neurologia e literatura. E eu pergunto isso porque quando eu era estudante de medicina, meus professores de neurologia costumavam dizer que a neurologia é rica em diagnósticos, mas pobre em tratamento. E que os diagnósticos propiciavam elaboração intelectual que gerava muitos volumes. É verdade isso?
Well, first, I think you are being very modest in omitting yourself from the list of doctor writers. Chekhov, of course, sometimes used to say that literature is my mistress and medicine is my lawful wedded wife, and to feel that there was a division in him between the writing part and the doctor part. Whereas with myself, I feel there's no such division. And in a way, although I've had a range of subjects, the subjects for me have always been clinical. I have no writing which is separated from my clinical work. although, as you say, neurology may be short on therapy, I think it is long on narrative. I think that many patients with neurological problems have extraordinary and involved stories to tell about the worlds which they have been thrust into, and so in a way it seems to me a very natural subject which calls out one's desire to communicate their experiences and to tell stories.
Os seus livros parecem tratar, em alguma medida, da pequena diferença que há entre normalidade e anormalidade. E há um ditado brasileiro que diz que, em terra de cego, quem tem um olho é rei. Numa ilha de daltônicos, que é o tema do seu livro, quem vê cores é anormal?
There is a story by H.G. Wells which is set in Brazil and where this proverb is quoted, where a sighted man finds his way into a community of blind people and he thinks he is going to be king, and that they are very defective. But when nightfall comes, of course there are no lights, he stumbles over things, and then they start thinking he is defective and also subject to strange hallucinations caused by these pathologies in his face, which he calls eyes. And finally he falls in love with a girl in the village, but the elders decide they will only permit him to marry if he consents to the removal of his eyes so that he can be normal like the rest of them. I think the story brings out that normality to some extent is a matter of social judgment and context and opinion, but obviously only to some extent. Now, this story was very much in my mind when I visited the island of the colorblind, where a large number of people have no conception of color. I think to some extent they thought of us color normals as preoccupied by color, as obsessed with something non-existent or and probably trivial. I think one has to distinguish a medical frame of reference from an ethnic frame of reference. One can say in medical terms that these people have no cones in their eye, that vital visual receptors are missing, and of course they are abnormal. But they themselves construct worlds with what they have. They are at the center of their own worlds, and they do not have a feeling of being defective. In their own terms, they are normal. Mm-hmm. And so I think one always needs these two frames of reference.
Uhum. Essa questão de quem é louco e quem não é nas sociedades humanas é uma coisa sempre complicada, porque se você pensar bem, uma série de sociedades humanas são completamente loucas. Tem aquele famoso caso de um filme, eu realmente não lembro qual é, que passa na Primeira Guerra Mundial e que, de repente, os loucos de um asilo saem, certo? E se percebe que naquele momento era muito mais sadio, muito mais sensato ser um louco do que participar daquela carnificina. Até que ponto a loucura não é uma construção social também? Porque, de repente, uma pessoa pobre é louca, mas uma pessoa rica pode ser meramente um excêntrico.
This is certainly a matter of continued argument with people like Lang and especially Thomas Zass on one side, talking about the myth of mental illness. On the one hand, I think there is clearly a biological and neurological disposition to manic depressive disorder or schizophrenia, to use some of our medical names. But equally, I think the shaping of these biological conditions depends very much on the personality, on context, and they may also be seen as attempts to redefine purpose and meaning in one's life. So they are existential adventures on the one hand, and biological illnesses on the other. And it's complex. And I've known a number of people who have very much regretted having been given tranquilizers and treated and not being able to explore the psychosis in its own terms. I don't quite know where I stand here.
Dr. Sachs, a avaliação de paciente, e que o senhor mostra nos seus livros, fazer com maestria, é aspecto fundamental no tratamento e na condução de caso. O senhor acredita que a evolução tecnológica, em termos de diagnósticos, em termos terapêuticos, que não deixa de ser fascinante, pode no futuro mudar completamente esse relacionamento e fazer com que se perca realmente o que há de mais importante, que é o relacionamento de observação entre o médico e o paciente?
Until relatively recently, of course, diagnoses in neurology and neurosurgery depended very much on the diagnostic skill and experience of the clinician, and neurologists were known above all, par excellence, as diagnosticians. Now, as you say, much of this role can be taken over and usurped by brain imaging and other forms of technology, and I certainly know some colleagues who feel they may be out of work, that they may no longer have a role to fill. Now, I am very pro-technology myself. It would be mad to be otherwise. But I'm also very conscious of that it can encroach or may appear to encroach on the doctor's role or the human role. But I don't really think it does, because I think that the diagnosis is only, establishing the diagnosis is only a part, and a small part, of the total relationship of doctor and patient, and there are all sorts of questions of judgment and feeling which will still be there. I think that technology somehow has to be incorporated into the relation. Martin Buber used to say, we must humanize technology before it dehumanizes us. And I think this is a very present problem right now for us.
O senhor não vê então com preocupação, Dr. Sachs, o fato de ter uma corrente, por exemplo, da psiquiatria, que basicamente olha para os sintomas e a partir dos sintomas dá um diagnóstico e se satisfaz com isso? Não é um pouco isso que está acontecendo com a psiquiatria hoje? Ela não é operacional, ela não tem o desejo de, vamos dizer assim, diagnosticar, dar um nome para a queixa que a pessoa está trazendo e encontrar a melhor solução o mais rápido possível para ela? O senhor não vê isso com preocupação? Isso não é, de uma certa maneira, o fim dessa clínica que o senhor está dizendo?
I'm not sure how it is in Brazil, but certainly it sounds as if there may be a situation similar to the States, where there is a diagnostic Bible called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and here every diagnosis is arrived at by a handful of criteria of symptoms. I mean, you are deepening the question which your colleague brought up, and this is that a diagnosis is not enough. One has to think in terms of the process which is going on and its impact on the person's life. And I'm very struck, having worked for many years at psychiatric hospitals as well as neurological and geriatric hospitals, that sometimes the old charts from the 1920s or the 1930s are much richer in clinical and human terms than the present ones, which may list a few symptoms and give a diagnosis and tell one nothing. I think there are many dangers in this, not least the fact that that information is a great casualty. I think it takes many, many hours of listening and attending and thinking to get any idea of what is going on in a person in their life. You may be able to make a technical diagnosis in 2 seconds. I can look at someone a mile away and say they're Parkinsonian, but that's only the beginning. I don't even need a CAT scan.
Dr. Sachs, neste sentido do diagnóstico, o senhor escreve nas apresentações feitas aos livros do neurologista russo Alexander Romanovich Luria, que o senhor próprio defende uma ciência romântica, tal qual o Luria, e que, tal qual o Luria, que teria sido o inventor, o primeiro escritor do gênero romance neurológico, então o senhor se colocaria neste gênero. Eu perguntaria, não seria este romance neurológico também um instrumental de diagnóstico? E com isto, nós já sabemos o que a literatura ganha, mas o que ganha a ciência?
Eu queria acrescentar uma pergunta, pegar uma carona dele. O que o senhor acha que o diagnóstico adianta para a pessoa que é diagnosticada? A quem serve o diagnóstico?
You've asked a lot of questions between you. Let me think here. Now, Luria himself, the great Russian neuropsychologist, took over these terms of regarding the classical scholar and the romantic scholar. The classical scholar, who is a meticulous analyst and examines all the details, and the romantic scholar who puts it all together. For him, romantic science and romantic neurology consisted in trying to give a portrait of a person's mind and life and behavior as a whole. But he also says in his autobiography that he was divided from the very start regarding the strengths and weaknesses of 2 complementary approaches. One of these he calls nomothetic, and the nomothetic approach is diagnostic. It looks for a genus of disease, and the other is idiographic, which is concerned with presenting a unique individual. Now, in fact, in his 2 novel-like books, which he only published in his 60s, The Man with a Shattered World and The Mind of an Eminist. Incidentally, Peter Brook is making a film of The Mind of an Eminist. In fact, one finds an alternation between these 2 approaches. I read the first 10 pages of The Mind of an Eminist thinking it was a novel, actually thinking it was it reminded me very much of Borges' short story, Funes the Memorious. And then there were technical details, nomothetic details, which made me realize that it was a study. As you say, the romantic part will make such studies sympathetic to artists, which is why Peter Brook, say, has been interested in making a film of The Mind of an Eminist, and perhaps why he's made a play from some of my own work. On the other hand, the details must also be put in, and it is very, very difficult. And whether it's in principle possible, I don't know. You know, this is discussed in very general terms by the philosopher Hume, when he compares the artist with the anatomist. And Hume says that but Hume insists that an anatomical, analytical knowledge is essential to being an artist. What use is a diagnosis to a patient? It may give the patient some sort of anchor. I think some patients certainly want to have a clear grasp of what process is going on in them, its nature, its possibilities, what may be done about it. Others may not want to know.
So,
Dr. Sachs, em vários dos casos que o senhor relata, de vez em quando aparece a arte tendo um certo papel terapêutico. Hoje fala-se muito do relacionamento entre arte e ciência. Será que nós poderíamos pensar que esse relacionamento começa no cérebro?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to approach an answer. Let me first think back to my awakenings patients who, even before they had been given L-Dopa, would sometimes respond to music in a remarkable way. These people were often frozen and unable to move or speak, but sometimes a person who couldn't walk could dance, someone who couldn't speak could sing, and music would liberate them for a little while. There are many other sorts of role which music can play with neurological patients. But we, of course, we all respond to music. One of the things which interests me and which is hotly under investigation at the moment is what parts of the brain become active in the response to music and in different sorts of music. Are there separate parts of the brain which respond to pitch, to rhythm, to timbre? It's known that, and Luria described how lesions on one side in eminent conductors, how lesions on the left side of the brain might sometimes remove the ability to analyze music, might remove some of musical intelligence, but allow full emotional response, whereas lesions on the other side might allow full emotional response, but maybe I put this the wrong way around. And one knows, for example, that naive listeners, so-called, listen mostly with the right half of the brain, and as they become more sophisticated, the left and linguistic half. One also knows that there's an interesting condition called Williams syndrome, and that this is not Robin Williams, it's another Williams. It's rather rare, only about 1 person in 30,000 has it. But children and adults with Williams syndrome, as well as being very precocious verbally and socially, are very precocious musically, although very defective in many other ways. They can't tie a shoelace, they can't cross the road, and one knows in them that the entire auditory system, from the primary auditory cortex right up to parts of the temporal lobe, are enlarged, and other parts of the brain are smaller. It's such no. I'm sure sort of the sort of thinking which is central to art and also which is central to science must originate in the brain. One knows that narrative, the power to give narratives, develops very early. Incidentally, it is very high in people with Williams syndrome, and I think narratives are one of the first forms of art. The ability to understand paradigms or theories comes later. I'm sorry, I've got myself into a labyrinth.
Não, a minha pergunta é um pouco parecida com a dela, mas é uma outra dualidade. Em vez de arte e ciência, é a dualidade mente e matéria. Até que ponto os tratamentos e todo o conhecimento da neurologia não estão influenciados demais por essa divisão tradicional entre o que é a matéria e o que seria a mente? Que, aliás, é uma coisa muito complicada de você definir o que é. E eu queria a sua opinião sobre isso, porque existe até aquele famoso trocadilho em inglês, lamento ter que falar em inglês, mas é um trocadilho em inglês. What's mind? It doesn't matter. What's matter? It doesn't mind. Como você é possível tratar a mente de uma pessoa ao mesmo tempo tratando a matéria, ou seja, dando uma substância química? Seria possível tratar pessoas com problemas neurológicos apenas pensando no lado bioquímico? Quer dizer, uma substância que mudasse o comportamento dela?
Well, I think you've asked the deepest question of all. The separation has been strong since Descartes, who thought in terms of two principles, an immaterial res cogitans, the mind, and a spatially extended mindless body. Which moved automatically and had reflexes. He regarded dogs as automata. I don't think he could ever have had a dog, because a dog clearly has a spirit, a personality.
Os meus cachorros são completamente doidos.
Dr. Sachs?
Yes.
Sim. Agora, uma pergunta de um caráter um pouco mais pessoal. Lendo a sua biografia, a gente tem dois detalhes que chamam a atenção. Um, que o senhor é filho de neurologistas. Seu pai e sua mãe foram ambos neurologistas. O que é uma coisa rara, acho que mesmo para filho de médicos. E a outra coisa é que o senhor sofreu de enxaqueca. A pergunta é, qual dessas duas coisas levou à neurologia? Ou foram as duas coisas que o levaram à neurologia?
Well, I think they both had an influence. I should say that though my parents both trained in neurology, neither of them stayed in neurology. Actually, they couldn't stand it. And, my father became a general physician, and my mother became a general surgeon. I myself, like my mother and others in my family, certainly had migraines from a very early age. Not just the headache part, but the visual part, in which one might go blind to one side or lose the sense of color. And these both frightened and fascinated me, and I think showed me very early that the world is not given to one except by grace of a brain which works normally. I think it's probably no coincidence that my first clinical work and book was on migraine, although it dealt much more with the 1,000 patients I'd seen. However, I will not divulge the identity of case number 75.
Dr. Sachs, nós podemos retomar um pouquinho isso que o Ricardo estava falando e retomar a outra dualidade também. Nos seus relatos, há uma associação muito forte entre doença e self. Para um médico, para um neurologista, é preciso escolher uma definição de self? É preciso saber que self é esse? O senhor escolheu alguma? É a do Edelman? É necessário isso?
I'm not entirely sure that I follow you.
Há uma necessidade de escolher entre o que é o self, para tratar do self?
I think that the self is not something which exists in vacuo, like the Cartesian self, like the cogito ergo sum. I don't think you can know yourself from cogitating. I think you know yourself in relation to another person. And you might say, amo ergo sum, or something like this. So I think the self of both the physician and the patient develop together, and they develop in interaction, and it's the nature of this interaction and this intersubjectivity, to use the jargon, which to some extent defines what aspects of self are active in both, and perhaps active in a collaborative and positive way, and perhaps in a negative way.
Dr. Sachs, nós falamos há pouco a respeito de estímulos musicais, em que haveria uma grande melhora no caso de pacientes submetidos a esse tipo de estímulo, musicais, visuais. Hoje, modernamente, se fala muito no conceito de neuroplasticidade, que seria a capacidade ou de reestruturação de estruturas neuronais, ou ainda a capacidade de ativar áreas que estivessem teoricamente adormecidas. Como o senhor vê essa neuroplasticidade em relação às observações, todas o que o senhor fazia, e os testes que o senhor executava, os estímulos, em relação aos resultados obtidos?
Eu queria uma carona também na pergunta. Como estimular essas áreas? Que tipo de ação poderia fazer? Seria uma ação, por exemplo, como a música, uma ação social ou uma ação bioquímica mesmo? Que tipo de efeito muda o cérebro?
I think there's been a profound change, of course, which we're all very aware of in the last 10 years, allowing how much plasticity there may be in the nervous system. Certainly in my training days, we used to use terms like pre-dedicated for parts of the brain. It was understood, for example, that parts of the temporal lobe were dedicated or committed to auditory processing. But it's come out very clearly. I think it's a beautiful example of cerebral plasticity with regard to people born deaf who use sign language. One has very nice physiological evidence that the auditory cortex has been given another function. It's been reallocated for visual processing. I think this is sort of very spectacular. I think the degree of recovery and rehabilitation which may be possible after a stroke or after the resection of a tumor would not be possible without new tissue taking over some of the lost functions, although clearly there's a limit to which this can occur. You are generalizing here in terms of learning, and clearly all learning involves changes in the brain, and learning is possible to one's death. I know I've had a little example of this myself, because recently I've been going to a swimming guide because I wanted to alter my swimming. And it's interesting learning a new motor skill in one's 7th decade. It's not as easy as in your first or second decade, but you can do it. And I'm sure that if one, as it were, had sufficiently sensitive brain imaging, one could see some of the changes which had occurred. Within limits, experience constantly molds the brain, and so the brain is as much a reflection of experience as it predetermines it. I mean, for this reason, all our brains become personal. You can have a heart transplant, you can have a liver transplant. There may be some problems with rejection. There is a certain immunological identity in the heart or the liver, but there's no personal identity. On the other hand, I don't think you can have a brain transplant because your brain is yours and your brain is you. And here we're coming back to the duality.
A ficção científica, acho que não. A ficção científica está toda hora mudando o cérebro do Frankenstein, do Hitler, essas coisas todas.
Um crítico norte-americano, Harold Bloom, inclui Freud entre os maiores escritores do século, em alguma medida retirando da Freud da discussão sobre a precisão das teorias dele, mas pondo como um literato propriamente. Lendo esse seu novo livro, A Ilha dos Daltônicos, eu tive a sensação de ler um livro de viagens. Recentemente o senhor escreveu um pequeno texto para New Yorker, que é um texto de memórias, quase literário mesmo. O senhor se sente migrando para a literatura estrito sensu, digamos assim, descolando dos seus temas originais sobre neurologia e medicina para uma pura ficção?
A curious way of, in a way of criticizing or perhaps less valuing Freud's science would be to say he is a writer, and this is something which he sometimes said of himself. No, I agree, he is a splendid writer, and the seductive quality of his writing and the way in which in imagination he anticipates various objections is, and I think the sheer beauty of the narrative sometimes carries one along. For myself, although I may have some excursions of one sort and another into non-neurological realms, and there are some botanical excursions in my new book, and there was a swimming excursion in the New Yorker, if that's the one you're referring to. But for me, these are excursions, and since you talk about self, I think my central self or central identity does have to do with being with patients and being a neurologist. If I have a next book, I could never really anticipate. I think my next book will be on aging, and this is going to involve, amongst other things, a very close look at things like Alzheimer's disease and its what goes on in the brain and its impact on the person, the family, the community. I don't think I am in flight from medicine.
Mas eu reparei no último livro, nesse dos daltônicos, que as notas de rodapé que o senhor colocou são enormes. As notas dariam um livro à parte, e sobre assuntos os mais diversos. E um dos quais, que aparece muito no livro, é a botânica e a história natural. Por que o senhor coloca tantos assuntos diferentes no livro? Qual é essa necessidade?
You're right. Footnotes are very important to me, and I have to say my publishers will not like this, that in the last 2 weeks I've added another 15 footnotes to the book, which will get into future editions. It seems to me that on the one hand, one needs, I think, to have a relatively straightforward narrative or argument. It must be tight, it must be coherent, it mustn't be diverted too much. But on the other hand, different points in the narrative or the argument may give rise to reflections, may make the mind meditate on other things, and the sort of the side trips of the mind, the excursions, become the footnotes. If I didn't have footnotes, I think the book would meander like the Amazon, although it would finally get to its destination like the Amazon. Mm-hmm. But I love footnotes, And since you were talking about autobiographic things, some of my earliest experiences were of seeing my father read the Talmud. And in the Talmud, the central script has commentaries and commentaries on commentaries, and the idea of this sort of delights me. A friend of mine, in fact, said I suffered from comentaria, although I don't know that this word will translate into Portuguese.
Dr. Sachs, o senhor cita em algumas das entrevistas que eu vi que o senhor deu, né, cita um cientista chamado Edelman como um grande pensador, uma pessoa que pensa do mesmo jeito que o senhor ou na mesma direção que o senhor. Como é que é a concepção, Dr. Sachs, de como é que os senhores concebem essa corrente, né? Concebe o cérebro humano hoje? E o senhor disse ali, quando você estava respondendo para um outro jornalista, o seu cérebro é você. O senhor vai tão longe assim? A gente pode afirmar, o senhor afirma que eu sou o meu cérebro? Ou que o senhor é o seu cérebro? Exclusivamente? Qual é o limite disso?
Well, first, not just one's brain, but one's body. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the stomachache I have at the moment is also part of me. Mm-hmm. Somewhere Wittgenstein says that the human body is the best expression of the human soul. Mm-hmm. I used to be tormented by dualisms of one sort and another for many years. I know that when I thought very much in computational terms, I used to say, well, okay, there's the hardware and the software, but there's also me. And this was a sort of version of what is sometimes called the ghost in the machine. But clearly, the brain, if one insists on calling it a machine, is not like any man-made machine or any other machine in the universe. And precisely because it is so plastic and it becomes individual. Now, Edelman is a great neurobiologist who got a Nobel Prize when he was a young man for his work on the immune system and for defining the notion of immune identity, how the immune system recognizes self and not self. And we spoke earlier about heart transplants and liver transplants. These are questions of immune identity. Now, in the last 15 years, Edelman has turned his attention to the brain and the question of personal identity. And he has brought together a very complex, multi-leveled theory, which I really couldn't attempt to condense, which at least provides a possible way in which experiences will shape the brain, categories will arise and be further categorized from percepts to concepts, and the mind and the personality may be then embodied in the brain.
O que o senhor está dizendo, só um minutinho, o que o senhor está dizendo então é que a experiência pode moldar o cérebro, quer dizer, não é só, vamos dizer assim, não é só o neurotransmissor que pode fazer um comportamento ou uma experiência, mas quer dizer, um comportamento pode talvez desencadear uma forma de funcionamento do cérebro.
Well, absolutely. This is always the sort of the nature-nurture. Now, no one is more conscious of the details of neuroanatomy and physiology and chemistry and genetics and embryology and evolution than Edelman. He gets furious at people who think in terms of quantum consciousness and don't know enough about the brain. And yet he makes a point that, say, even in identical twins, the details of neuronal circuitry will already be different at birth, because it's not just genetic determination, but the migration and deaths of nerve cells during pregnancy, which will contribute this. So already at birth, people are disposed to interpret, to construct a world and to construct their perceptions in different ways, and they go from here. Obviously, the sense of biological constraints are always there. One is not free to become anyone. One is not free to become a Mozart. All the neuroplasticity in the world won't help one become a Mozart. You have to have the right, you have to be born with the right nervous system to become a Mozart. Though being born with the right nervous system is probably not enough. You may need the right opportunities and training and encouragement and everything else. So I think Edelman has simply helped one refine some of the eternal sort of notions of nature and nurture.
Dos seus livros fica evidente que o senhor é um médico sui generis. É um médico que não apenas trata pacientes neurológicos, como convive com pacientes neurológicos e às vezes até mora com esses pacientes neurológicos. Isso ficou evidente também no filme O Tempo de Despertar. O que o senhor acha da atual conjuntura da assistência médica no mundo, de uma maneira geral? Em outras palavras, o senhor acha que no sistema atual de assistência médica, que vigora na maior parte dos países, há lugar para um médico que faz medicina como o senhor faz?
I think my way of practicing medicine is in a way old-fashioned and the traditional way, and I think it needs to continue, and medical systems have to allow it somehow, otherwise there will be, and one sees to some extent there has been a severe sort of breakdown of relationships between doctors and patients. Patients will feel that they are not being paid attention to, that they are treated as objects. Doctors may feel that they are being treated as objects, as diagnostic machines, and the whole, my father, who practiced medicine almost till he was 94, he always used to say medicine is fun, it's great fun. And he enjoyed medicine, and I think that the fun and joy, as well as the is at risk. And but how fullness of relationship can be kept in face of all sorts of economic restraints and technical changes, is a huge subject, but it must be kept.
Dr. Sachs, eu queria falar um pouco sobre a sua perna. A perna que o senhor usou para se apoiar. No momento de recuperação, no grande momento mágico, que é também um momento de grande beleza literária, que o senhor é atirado na piscina depois de um fenômeno de fantasma, da perna enquanto fantasma. Então o senhor escreve que recupera naquele momento a música da perna. Então já falamos aqui um pouco da música enquanto fator terapêutico, mas não na direção contrária. A recuperação da música que já está intrínseca dentro do corpo, e essa música, depois o senhor explica em termos científicos do funcionamento do sistema nervoso periférico, não é? Como tão importante quanto o sistema nervoso central. E eu gostaria que o senhor explicasse um pouco melhor o que é esta música da perna.
Well, first of all, I need to say that although in the preface to that book, A Leg to Stand On, I call it a neurological novel, it was not fiction, and it would be indiscreet to show you the scar, although I must say I have an impulse to do so. One certainly sees rhythm and grace in the movements of animals. In my biology days, I was fascinated by animal movement, and the patterns of movement, and I still am. The Harvey, who described the circulation of the blood, also wrote another book on animal movement, although in a strange way this wasn't published till 3 centuries after his death. In the first half of the book, he had gone to Galileo's lectures in Padua when he was a young man, and he attempted a Galilean analysis in terms of a mechanical analysis of movement, in terms of inertia and momentum. In the second half of the book, he said that this was not enough, and he spoke of the grace and rhythm of movement, and he spoke of movement as the silent music of the body. This grace of movement is unconscious. I think if one becomes self-conscious, one tends to become awkward and clumsy and manneristic. It's unconscious. It can be knocked out by various diseases. For example, in Parkinsonism, movements can become wooden and almost robotic, and instead of having a graceful rhythm, there can be a sort of festination, a stutter. I had one patient, a music teacher, who said that she had been unmusicked by Parkinsonism and that she needed music, either the playing of music or the imagination of music, to enable her to move. I mean, this is a metaphor, although since you mentioned Luria often speaks of kinetic melody in these terms, and one also wants to speak about the orchestration of movement and the harmony of movement. When I wrote about a surgeon who had Tourette syndrome with these sudden, violent, convulsive movements, I couldn't imagine, what sort of life he had. And when he told me he was a surgeon, I was incredulous and sort of said, you would sort of cut the aorta in two. What one saw when he was operating was that everything was orchestrated and focused, and one really had a feeling of a musical organization sort of dominating the motor system and dominating the attention. I'm afraid I've forgotten the original question.
Dr. Sachs, yes. Eu queria perguntar uma coisa. O senhor começou a contar aí uma história humana dessas que o senhor conta nos seus livros, né? Uma história de um cirurgião que tinha síndrome de Tourette. De todas as histórias, eu li muitas histórias suas e devo dizer que quando li as primeiras, 10 anos atrás, quando a Imago lançou aqui o seu livro, O Homem que Confundia Sua Mulher com Chapéu, fiquei encantada com as histórias. E eu queria perguntar uma coisa para o senhor, quer dizer, de todas essas histórias que o senhor, todas essas pessoas que o senhor conheceu e essas histórias que o senhor teve respeito, tempo e dedicação e amor, acho, né, para ouvir, para viver, qual foi a que mais encantou o senhor? Qual foi desses personagens todos, qual é o ser humano que, sei lá, que mais tocou o senhor, com o qual o senhor mais se identificou, de quem o senhor mais gostou?
They all enchanted me the most. When I'm attending to a person and thinking about them, they seem the most interesting in the world. It's I feel similar, say, with some of my students. If I'm asked which is my favorite student, they've all been my favorite students. So I'm not sure that I can really select, but I think among people I've seen recently, I have been very deeply moved by Temple Grandin, the remarkable autistic woman who is a professor of animal psychology and who has such a deep grasp and a passionate sympathy for the feelings and the thoughts of cattle, but is so puzzled by human behavior, although she always says she is studying us very closely, which is why she calls herself an anthropologist on Mars. But in a way, so much is missing for her, and yet she is searching for meaning and satisfaction and love and work, as we all need. I think I've been especially moved by her, but I'm especially moved by everyone I see, and certainly by everyone I write about.
Dr. Sachs, em alguma medida, na mesma linha dessa pergunta, seus livros são best-sellers no mundo todo. O que o senhor acha que atrai tantos leitores a lerem livros sobre síndromes e doenças mentais ou neurológicas? Quer dizer, é o medo de ter uma dessas síndromes ou uma dessas doenças, ou é uma espécie de prazer, de comemoração de não ter essa doença e, portanto, lendo o livro, se distinguir das vítimas da doença?
Well, I think these feelings may enter and be stronger in some people, but I'm sure they are not the main attractions. I don't think these are very sort of attracting. First, I think there is a great wave of interest now in the brain and the mind, as there's a great wave of interest in, at the other extreme, in cosmology and the new physics. And people are interested in the birth of the universe, the Big Bang, but they're also interested in this 3-pound universe, which is the brain, and which is us. And so at one level, I think my narratives, musings, sort of pondering the relation of brain to mind and brain to identity, interest. Secondly, I think my stories are not just stories of disease and fear of disease and gratitude that one doesn't have them. I think they're stories of struggle, of negotiation, sometimes of survival, sometimes of transcendence. And I think the idea of battling with a disease or living with it, or even in a strange way, turning it to creative use or finding some advantage in it, but not in a perverse way. I think all this can be reassuring. I think of many of my patients as heroes, not as pitiful, but as warriors and as heroes. And Luria often does the same, and many patients do the same. Thirdly, and then I will stop because I could go on. Thirdly, I think that perhaps in this region, which is a fearful region, a human voice is somehow reassuring, and this is not sort of the cold voice of the doctor giving the statistics for Alzheimer's disease, but another sort of voice which somehow may make the reality more bearable as well as more intelligible. But I don't know.
Doutor, o senhor escolheu campo da medicina, né, em que o senhor escolheu um pedaço da medicina para clinicar, em que inúmeras vezes o senhor não podia oferecer a cura, tá? Como é que o senhor, ao longo de toda a sua experiência como médico e com essa perspectiva de ouvir o paciente que o senhor tem, de dar a ele, ouvi-lo como se ele fosse a coisa mais extraordinária do mundo, né? Como é que o senhor lidou com a sua impotência de resolver muitos dos problemas? Os médicos geralmente se propõem, ou pelo menos, sei lá, há uma certa promessa, né, dos médicos de que eles podem curar tudo, né? Acho que o senhor se defrontou muitas vezes com o contrário.
Well, I think this is a reason why both of my parents, as I said, fled neurology and couldn't stand it. Because you know, if you are a surgeon, you may achieve an important change straight away. You see what you've done. The work is before you, and if you're a general physician, you save someone's life, you treat an attack of asthma or whatever. And as you say, much of neurology, deals with incorrigible or seemingly incorrigible disease and damage. Now, the Awakenings situation was a rare exception. And sometimes other patients would come up with multiple sclerosis and with strokes and with other problems and say, I wish I had sleeping sickness, you know, I wish I had Parkinsonism, which then you could do something about it. One of the other things I describe in my new book, there's the island of the colorblind, but I also speak of the island of cycads, which is Guam, and these primitive trees grow all over the island, but there's also a strange, terrible disease on the island, which is really a progressive, fatal disease of the nervous system, which has some similarities to the post-encephalitic disease, and may be due to eating the trees. But my colleague, whom I went round with, we did house calls, sometimes I would see him weeping at his impotence. He didn't show it directly, but I think that if you know, the therapeutic desire was an exclusive or an overwhelming element in me, I couldn't bear neurology. But since the desire to understand and curiosity is at least as strong, this makes it more tolerable. But you know, but you mustn't suppose that I wouldn't want to see things different. And I'm very excited, like all my colleagues, at some of the advances we're seeing now. Some of which depend on neural plasticity or neural transplants, the finding of nerve growth factors, and a continually more refined knowledge. I think more and more, you know, 10 years ago, it was never thought that you could have any regeneration in the nervous system. And now we know there can be some, and one can also have neuroprotective medications, and I don't become too depressed by the implacable nature sometimes of neurological disease or my own therapeutic impotence. What does upset me, and profoundly, are questions of mistreatment. Seeing people not cared for, seeing negligence, seeing cruelty, seeing indignity, and this is very different because here one is not dealing with an amoral nature, but with immoral human beings.
Dr. Sachs, a gente vê, principalmente nos grandes centros urbanos, em cidades como São Paulo, por exemplo, o crescimento de doenças como a síndrome de pânico, alcoolismo, né? Os casos de depressão, se toma Prozac, por exemplo, hoje, como se tomava xarope há muitos tempos atrás. Nós temos uma nova epidemia, vamos dizer assim, de doenças neurológicas, uma epidemia moderna de doenças neurológicas. Poderia-se dizer isso?
I certainly think that stress in modern life and modern cities whether it's greater than it's ever been, I don't know. I'm sure it takes different forms. And in a city of 13 million, there are a great many forms it can take. Some of this, I think, has to do with physical, or in a way, partly physical problems like congestion. We all need space. Animals need space. If you have 13 million people in one place, you're on top of each other. We are very crowded here. Traffic jams are particularly intolerable. You can't get away from people. Noise and smell are all around you. People don't have gardens. This is very much the case in New York, which is a city of apartments. I think one has to have contact with nature, one way and another. I think that the number of meaningful, I think meaning in work may get less. The artisan is disappearing. We've said earlier the pleasure and meaning of medicine, of being a doctor itself can be threatened. What else is happening? Well, as they say, to quote Nietzsche, God is dead, or the forms of spiritual security and comfort and dogma are under attack and can't fortify many people as before, and we break down in different ways. As a doctor, my first work was with patients with migraine. Now, migraine is a neurological disorder, a physiological disorder. The disposition to it is probably genetic, but the pressure to have attacks may depend very much on the pattern of people's lives. And I feel, in a way, that I partly got a picture of the stresses of life in New York through the pattern of my patients' migraines. I'm so long-winded, I forget the original question.
Nessa linha, eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta. Acho que realmente tem esse clima catastrófico, né? Como o senhor disse, não apenas... Nietzsche diz que Deus está morto e o Woody Allen acrescenta, Deus está morto e não se encontra nenhum encanador nos fins de semana. Né? Mas realmente há uma sensação assim de grande aumento de doenças resultantes do estresse, né? Sobretudo doenças mentais. E também, paralelamente, ao crescimento das terapias biológicas. Né? Eu gostaria que o senhor comentasse um pouquinho em relação ao papel nas doenças mentais, que são vizinhas da sua área, né? Da terapia biológica comparada com a psicoterapia clássica freudiana.
In the States, at least, the pendulum has swung strongly in both directions. I think prior to 1960, there was a strong emphasis on psychoanalysis and counseling, and then when some of the tranquilizers became available, the movement has been very much more to a biological psychiatry. I think that both are needed in many people, although one might say that there are economic considerations which dispose to using drugs. If you can titrate someone, if you can get someone with manic depressive disorder on the right dose of lithium, then perhaps you don't have to pay attention to them so much. But I think that with the commoner neuroses, that counseling and therapeutic attention are relatively of more importance than drugs, and in the psychoses, drugs may be crucial. But I think there's a very strong place for both. And if I can mention, for example, because he himself has brought it out publicly, Robert Hughes, the great Australian art critic, who has recently brought out a wonderful book on art and a wonderful television series, but the pressure of this caused a sort of breakdown in him and made him drink heavily and so forth. Now, he has written about this, saying that drugs and psychoanalysis were of equal importance to him, and that although the analysis would not have, he needed drugs to become accessible to the analysis, yet the analysis, by tracing chains of vulnerability back to childhood, was also crucial. And so, so in general, I would say I think a balance is needed, and I think it's also needed in neurology and needed in all of medicine.
Dr. Sachs, o senhor tem manifestado interesse por comunidades. A neurologia parece se interessar por indivíduos, o cérebro individual. Quando o seu interesse vai para a comunidade, essa neurologia antropológica, nós poderíamos pensar que os distúrbios neurológicos são culturais?
In a culture, there may be some genetic disposition or some environmental threat, as I describe in my new book. So on the island of the colorblind, the normally extremely rare genetic condition of total color blindness, total daltonism, achromatopsia, 1 in 50,000 in the general population. Here this condition had become very common through intermarriage and isolation. On the island of Guam, there's suspicion of some physical environmental cause, whether it is a disease agent or the psychiatries or whatever it is. But I think this isn't your question. Your question is whether the thoughts of an individual or a culture can produce a neurological disease. I think not, although this may depend on how one defines disease, but it may certainly shape the disease to some extent. For example, Tourette's syndrome, which I'm very fond of, and as you see, and I find something liberating about the convulsive. But I traveled with a friend with Tourette's syndrome in many places over the world, and it was most easily accepted, I should say, in Holland, and especially in Amsterdam, where anything goes. Anything goes. But it was least tolerated in Japan. And in particular, I was struck by the fact that in Japan, vocal Tourette's, vocal outbursts, are almost non-existent. But perhaps motor Tourette's and sudden movements become exaggerated. So I think here one has a cultural shaping. Interestingly, a Tourette-like syndrome is endemic in some places in Indonesia and Malaya, and is called Lata. And the people with Lata have a special social role in the community. They are regarded, in a sense, as innocents or fools who are compelled to utter the truth in involuntary ejaculations.
Sorry. Duas perguntas. Uma curiosidade de cunho pessoal, já que estamos falando da síndrome de La Tourette. Quando o senhor esteve com o Dr. Carl Bennett, qual a aflição que o senhor teve mais? Quando ele estava com o bisturi na mão operando um paciente ou quando o senhor estava pegando uma carona de avião com ele? Essa é a primeira. E a segunda, em relação a resultados. E, às vezes, isso acontece muito, e a gente trabalhou um tempo com pacientes portadores de dor crônica, em que você, tecnicamente, conduzia a coisa de uma forma muito bem, não via como o paciente não poderia melhorar, mas ele persistia com o seu quadro. O senhor acha que, às vezes, um sintoma, uma dor, uma enxaqueca pode ser importante no próprio segmento de vida do paciente?
I had a little difficulty hearing some of the second question, but let me first address the first question. I think I wasn't particularly afraid either watching him operate or watching him fly. He did refer to himself as the world's only flying Tourette surgeon. He did Tourette a certain amount while he was flying. He would touch himself and touch the windscreen, and at one time I did have a fantasy that he would try and touch the propeller of the plane, or that he would spin the plane. People with Tourette's are often very fond of spinning or do a somersault, or since people with Tourette's like sometimes to play with boundary conditions, I thought he might go within sort of 2 foot of the mountain tops. But if he did, but I never doubted the sufficiency of control with either. Now, I'm afraid I didn't entirely hear what...
Second question. A segunda questão. Se o senhor acredita que, às vezes, a manutenção de um sintoma, ou de uma doença, ou de uma queixa, seja importante na manutenção e no segmento de vida de alguns certos pacientes.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think I first felt this when I worked with patients with migraine, when, as it were, one couldn't dislodge the migraine without something else, and hopefully something healthy, to take its place. I remember this occurred to me very strongly with one patient who always used to have migraines on Sunday, and then I gave him some medication, and he was delighted the first Sunday. The second Sunday, he said he was bored, he had nothing to do. And the third Sunday, he had an attack of asthma, and when I offered to treat the asthma, he then said, "Do you think I need to be ill on Sundays?" But I think that when a symptom has been present for a long while, it is bound to become part of one's life, and it can only be eased out rather gently. I saw this sometimes with my awakenings patients. I remember one man in particular in whom the L-DOPA didn't seem to work, and then he said that he was afraid to show me how improved he was in case I made too many demands on him. A case which struck me very, very strongly, which I describe in Anthropologist on Mars, is of the blind man, a man blind from birth, who was persuaded in middle life to have surgery and restoration of vision. it was thought that this would be a wonderful gift and open his life. But in fact, although he could see everything, he had the greatest difficulty interpreting the world. You know, you don't just see, you have to learn to see, and the visual parts of the brain just hadn't developed in this man, and he was thrown into a state of confusion and panic, and in a sense we had taken away his equilibrium, we had taken away his blindness. So I think, now obviously in an acute case I will act as quickly as the next man. I once did, I'm afraid my surgical technique wasn't very good, and I used a carving knife. I once did a crude tracheotomy on someone at a dinner table. He was in an epileptic attack. He had got a chicken leg down his trachea and couldn't do this. The only way to save his life was to do a tracheotomy, and I did it right then and there. I will act acutely when need be. But in general, I think one has to consider very carefully the equilibrium or the economy of patients, and the fact that sometimes one can't change straight away. And even if a medical or surgical change can be made straight away, adaptation is slow.
Deixa o Noval. Fez menos perguntas, por favor, depois.
Eu queria falar um pouco da sua paciente Rebeca, onde todas as terapias químicas não funcionaram, mas a terapêutica foi encontrada pela própria paciente no teatro, e depois o senhor tece o comentário de que a medicina ou a neurologia estaria muito preocupada com a defectologia, enquanto deveria se preocupar mais com a narratologia. E aí eu entendo narratologia como as relações, as grandes relações culturais. E a sua narrativa começa, quando conta a história de Rebeca, já começa contando da paixão de Rebeca pelos símbolos religiosos, pelos rituais religiosos, pelas velas, e que a observação do médico, a posteriori, percebe que a cura da paciente, uma paciente com apraxias e com agnosias graves, estava numa reintegração cultural. Eu gostaria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre a narratologia.
In the case of this young woman who was quite severely retarded, but emotionally rich and healthy and well developed, there wasn't that much one could do medically or surgically. It was very striking to see how ritual and symbol and drama made sense to her, and how being part of a dramatic group and acting and performing roles gave her some identity in a way. You were asking earlier about selves and identity, and to some extent actors are given the identity of their roles, and it was remarkable to see how this retarded woman could act Ophelia and in a way expand into realms and roles which would have seemed impossible, although I think we all do this in relation to art. And I think art has this, one of the functions of art is its possibility to enlarge consciousness in a radical way. I mean, none of us can compose like Mozart, but perhaps we can all appreciate him and be elevated and expanded to some extent. I spoke a little bit earlier about the power of narrative, of telling stories and following stories, say, developing in children much earlier than the ability to sort of read Euclid, although maybe with a Bertrand Russell it was the other way around. I think one sees in a way the converse of this sometimes in intellectual decline, in Alzheimer's disease, where certain formal sorts of thinking may become difficult, but storytelling and acting and musical performance may still be very well preserved. But in general, I think with everyone, and Luria used to stress this very, very much, it's not just a question of looking at the disease or the defect, but also looking at what is strong. So Luria and Vygotsky especially spoke of this with regard to deaf children. They said, okay, so they're deaf. There's not that much you can do in auditory terms, but use their vision. And you know, my own book on deaf people is very much about vision, and it's not about the lack of hearing so much as the heightening of vision and the way in which a visual language and a culture become possible.
Dr. Sachs, eu queria perguntar, talvez, enfim, eu queria perguntar o seguinte: o senhor disse que o senhor está pensando em escrever um livro sobre envelhecer, ou sobre o envelhecimento, ou sobre a velhice, não sei bem. O senhor é um homem muito observador e certamente observou a si próprio, né, ao longo da vida toda, né? O senhor diria que o seu cérebro está envelhecendo? O que será que está sendo para o senhor o envelhecimento? E isso está relacionado ao cérebro do senhor, esse órgão pelo qual o senhor tem tanta admiração?
Yes, I'm very conscious, all too conscious, of cerebral aging in some ways. I hope it's not cerebral disease, but I find that certain forms of recall, or at least access, become more difficult. Proper names escape me sometimes, and embarrassingly. They haven't been lost because usually they will come back. And to some extent, I have to make a memory of paper, as it were, in substitute for.
Mas isso é um enorme problema, o senhor acha?
Now, I don't think, if I have insight, I don't know, I don't think that general intelligence has been badly impaired so far. Now, loss of recent memory can be very specific. It was recorded of the 85-year-old Newton that he couldn't remember the beginning of any sentence he had started, but almost single-handed he was able to complete the Principia.
Nós estamos chegando ao final do nosso programa, infelizmente, mas a propósito da pergunta da Mônica, tem um escritor brasileiro chamado Nelson Rodrigues, que uma vez foi perguntado que conselho ele daria aos jovens. E ele disse: envelheçam. O senhor diria o mesmo para os jovens?
I think so.
Muito obrigado pela sua presença aqui no Roda Viva essa noite. Eu gostaria de agradecer a nossa bancada de entrevistadores, agradecer a sua atenção. Infelizmente, hoje você não pode participar do programa. Lembrar você que o Roda Viva volta na próxima segunda-feira, pontualmente, às 10h30 da noite. Até lá, uma boa semana e uma boa noite para você.